Hey everybody, it's Jeremy again. I'm sorry the video is a bit later than what I wanted to do. It's been quite a long time since I've been planning on doing this. Been thinking about it for a while, and for the audience who's watching, there's no material we're gonna go over, so you can just listen to it. You don't have to watch it, but it is gonna be a fairly long video, at least longer than they have been before. We're targeting effectively probably an hour to 90 minutes of me basically talking. Um, Now, I don't mean to bore you with these things. So they'll be broken down in chapters and chunks. So don't worry about effectively having to listen all of it. You can always go through a specific section and come back. So anyway, now that the disclaimer's out, yes, it's a serious video this time. There's no beanie. First I want to plug Onwards again. Thanks for basically sponsoring me and this video effectively in a sense. And while originally I was thinking about doing this for mostly only the Onwards Patreon, I thought this is actually very applicable, and I feel like everybody should probably, hear this and not just be behind a paywall. Not that you should go support the brand and, get some coaching out of it. But, for the most part, the video is about kind of some key truths, I want to say, that are maybe, not unique to me. I think everybody has in some way or another discerned these facts from, basically playing wargaming for a while, or even if you just basically kind of see a pattern develop if you follow like the competitive crowd online. the So I'm still a little bit sick, so if I sound sick, I apologize. Maybe you'll find my voice more tolerable this way because it's a bit decibel lower. But for the most part, the actual real important thing about like this video is I try to make it agnostic to the edition, meaning I don't know anything about fourth edition. I'm hoping this applies to fourth edition effectively. I feel like it can even technically apply to even 40k if you watch this, since it's basically not specific. We're going to use AOS terms, but there's a lot of things in here which are effectively not, can apply to 40k as well, right? And there's some broad abstract terminologies and concepts here we're dealing with. We're not doing like finite detail and in the minutia here, but for the most part, like uh, basically take a seat, pour a glass of scotch, start up a cigar. I don't know, whatever you feel comfortable with, and just like listen to my very low decibel voice as I'm going through these specific things. The agenda, if we're going to do this as a professional setting, no beanie. We have effectively 4 chapters we're going to cover. And they're broken down like this. I'm going to start with like basically the least impactful to the argument to the most impactful to the argument. Now, usually in the professional world, you're supposed to start the opposite way, but in this case for content creation, we're going to do it from the least possible. Not this, they're all important, like they're all relevant, and they all play key roles, and they build upon each other to basically effectively the lasting chapter, which is like when these are all playing together, or be put together, they're very, very powerful and make the case of the argument of why like this book is good, or not as good, or even arguably bad in some cases, right? So with further ado, I'm going to start with chapter 1, but I'm reading my notes and I forgot a whole part, so I'll go straight to it. Psych, not chapter 1. We're going to talk about what I mean by powerful and good competitively. um, Effectively, when a Battletome comes out, what makes a Battletome good, and it's very subjective, right? For me, what makes a Battletome good, before we think about the competitive environment, have some key features. It needs to be effectively, the rules need to mimic the core identity of the army, and they also obviously need to be powerful, but we'll go into how you identify that. But for the most part, like for me, what sucks, when I see a book Battletome comes up and I get interested in it, it's because the rules seem to mimic the identity that they're trying to create to the army. And not only that, the book doesn't lock you into one specific archetype of list construction. Now, I will say, like, there are some books which are very good, which really only have one list archetype. Giants. It's could argue. I mean, but for the most part, it's just that that doesn't necessarily mean that like it's not competitive because it has one less archetype. I don't necessarily think it's a good book if it has one less archetype, because use the example of giants, they have Wayne and Risen and Paratable as GHB's changes or as the meta changes, because one less archetype makes you a little bit more fun to be structured. But we're not gonna, this is not a criteria of how we're gonna analyze all of these tomes. I'm just highlighting in the introduction as like what a personal thing that I would prefer is that a book has more than one list archetype. And now let's talk about what makes it a book competitive and powerful. In the summation, if I was going to quantify that, it needs to have like a 55% winning rate, right? Floating between 50 to 55, right? If you break 55%, you're in like basically, I would arguably say probably targeted for some kind of balance, at some point or another, right? I think that's kind of like the Games Workshop mantra, is that like if your book is operating at a 55 plus winning rate, then you're probably targeted for some balance. So like right at the game, that should be the measurement of like what makes a book competitive, which is insane, right? Because competitive should be 45 to 55, right? Like, because that's like, it's kind of coin toss effectively averages, but you could supposed to see the skill factor of the player be the dominant reason why the win is the win at the end of the day, barring any dice rolls and whatever. But the reality is that that kind of range of winning, 45 to 55, isn't what like competitive players are going to gravitate towards too. They're going to try to gravitate towards the things which are 55 plus. And then there's also the reality that metric is also kind of flawed, because there's a lot of factors that go inside of just player skill and dice. Like, for example, like, is the matchup equal? Like, or am I playing, or is a player or me playing against a matchup that's incredibly advantageous to my opponent? Like, because of mission pairings, or because their army design has like either toolkit to, counteract my mechanics or whatever, right? Like, there's a lot of reasons why, right? So it should, when 55% winning rate is a good average medium to pick, because it's supposed to say that it wins against the broad majority of the field more often. But that doesn't actually analyze the problem of the army. It just analyzes there's a core mechanical thing that's, basically getting, basically winning in the environment. Like, there could be a reason like an army is very good and winning dominantly in the meta right now, but that's only because something isn't in the meta or not being played in the meta, and it actually just completely curb stomps it. So like there's a whole lot of factors like balance. Games Workshop's attempt to balance, or any company's attempt to balance, is met with a monochrome of effectively ridicule by the community, but it's a very hard job to do. And honestly, you should praise that they do anything really to try to balance anything. But the reality is that like, outside of it, you kind of want the game to be non-balanced, is the one I'm going to, because it keeps the players engaged, and then also the way it's impossible for them to, it's just not set up that level of requirement on these folks that like your game should be perfectly balanced when you're continuously releasing things, which, arguably some people will say, well, then maybe they should stop doing that so they can perfectly balance the game. But let's face it, they're not going to do that. So let's live within the realm of, our own, the reality that it is. And expecting perfect balance from them is ridiculous. But at least we shouldn't see an army that's breaking like 65 to 70% winning rate, like over a long period of time, because that's effectively at that point, the game is, not enjoyable for anyone, because what's going to happen is, like I said, competitive players or even regular players who are listening to this channel or reading online are going to gravitate towards those armies because they want to beat their friends, right? We're all basically internally competitive to a level to some extent or not. And what's the point if I'm going to drop $1,000 into something if like I'm going to keep losing of it? Some people have that mentality. I personally have that mentality, but I know I'm not the only one to have this. So, that's why they want to keep the balance relatively similar. So that way, when somebody makes a decision with their money, they're not making a decision based on winning rate, but based on like the aesthetic and all the other factors that are important about making the game have a long, effectively runway and being healthy and played by the folks, right? All right, well, that was way longer than I expected for that introduction. So now we're gonna go straight into chapter 1. No psych, I didn't forget anything. Now we're going into chapter 1. So, and chapter 1 is War Scrolls and Pitch Battle Profiles. Now, I don't know what it's going to be in 4th edition in terms of like pitch battle profile, so I'll caveat that immediately. But I'm assuming army construction is still going to have some kind of effectively restrictions, right? Like how we have battle line, leader requirements, and so forth. I can only imagine that will in some way or another be still a thing going forward. So maybe instead of pitch battle profile, think of it as like army restrictions, effectively, and that's a big part. So when folks basically go into a battle tome, the first thing you kind of have to understand from a vacuum before you read anything else in the vacuum is it's effectively how powerful the war scrolls are, and how they fit into the army construction. Because it's really cool to have some incredibly powerful war scrolls, but can you only take one of them out? Can you, like, how expensive are they? How much volume of the army are they taking? Like, there's a process of like, okay, this is the most, barring any unique characters or any like single things, this is the most powerful war scroll available in the book. I want to take it as much as possible, but I can only have two because I have to pay this other army requirement before I take it, right? Like battle line or leaders, and I can only have two. Well, what's the second most powerful battle scroll in that? Well, I can have 10 of that. So in terms of like, there's a value to volume in a sense that even quality can't overcome, right? So it's about having, most players would define it as efficiency, right? It's the efficiency and the power. Finding that weird niche, the triangulation point is what's important. It doesn't matter that the war scroll is the most powerful if you can only have like very few of it, and it doesn't actually play a huge role in like how the game actually is played. That's usually what I attribute to like god models, even though god models are unique and so forth. God models are always incredibly powerful. You can only ever have one. It usually takes a large portion of your army design, so which means you have less options for anything else, and they don't necessarily play to your winning strategy of the game, right? Because that's killing things isn't necessarily how you win the game in AOS, and I believe in 40k as well now. What's important is board control and being able to be destructive when you need to be destructive. You don't need to be destructive all of the time. You just need to be destructive when you need to be destructive, right? So things like paying this kind of vast premium for like these war scrolls necessarily does not give you the edge you're looking for at the table, right? Because, unlike 40k, the double turn mechanic really plays, hinders that kind of archetype, because in some cases, like, you might not even, like, even though your opponent might not kill a single thing out of your army that turned it double, but because they got to score these points without you being able to stop them from scoring it before, your entire, like, you just lost a lot of like basically potential like margin of win towards the end of the game, right? So we're going back to war scrolls now. So we talked about like how do you effectively see a war scroll that's powerful? How do you internalize that's powerful? Well, as I said, there's multiple vectors into deciding that. Firstly, like board control is a big important one. Like, how many models is it? How fast is it? Okay, or like, obviously unit. In case we're talking, since it doesn't have to be single model here. And like, does it like turn off the opponent's ability to score, like the Iron Jaws brutes and so forth? Like, things that affect board control are very powerful. So like, I would say that is number one on top of the power scale before we talk about destructive power and about recursion and resilience, right? And then obviously there's things like magic and so forth, but all those things play a role into these kind of three pillars of like effectively what makes a good war scroll. And so you'll find that this is a three pillar that gets repeated over chapters, but like, yeah, board control is the most important one. It defines how you're going to, it's what plays the most into the path to victory of any specific army. It is the ability to take space or take objectives or prevent your opponents from maneuvering in ways that they need to score points, right? Like, that is effectively, we're a point game. Anything that removes that or basically gives you an edge over your opponent is an incredibly powerful mechanic. Destructive power, in a sense, is basically kind of a form of board control, right? Because the intent is to remove board control units from your opponent through your destructive power, but also it threatens your opponent's basically ability to pressure the board because of the threat of the destructive power. but you could say, and in a sense, it is a degree of board control, right? It's like when you fundamentally break it down to a form of it. And then there's recursion and resilience. Once again, another aspect of board control, right? It's like how much do you curb the destructive power of your opponent's units, and how much are they sticky on the board, and things like that. Like so, fundamentally, short story. Board control is the most important power aspect of any war scroll. Any war scroll that gives you an edge on board control is incredibly powerful. And that can take the various example, like I said, brutes have the not scoring of your opponents. That is a very powerful? Is that like the most powerful? No, not at all. We have zombies, right? Which get countered by brutes, but unfortunately, zombies have more. I would arguably say maybe arguably some more destructive power than brutes. But the point of us trying to end recursion as well. So like it's a whole panoply of things, right? That would make these war scrolls evaluated to be powerful. Ignore the reality of their stats, right? Like how much saves, how many wounds. These are all valuable equations in deciding what is your board control state. And I know in 4th edition they're going to add like objective control numbers like they did for 40k, meaning like instead of having like the traditional AOS, like if you're 5 wounds you're 2, if you're a monster you're 5, like all that stuff, right? They're going to have their own units, are going to have their own like specific ones, but it's technically the most kind of like powerful mechanic in the game. So that's that kind of identify, like when you like try to pick out your most powerful war scrolls, you do, it's basically how much board control impact it has, and that's how you decide which one's the most. And then decisions have to be made about like how many can you fit, more than one, should you fit more than one, like things like that about list design that become more an art than basically science in a sense, right? And then so talking about that, it was just like it's once you evaluate all these war scrolls and how they're which ones are the most powerful, which ones can do the best, you have to really take into consideration what are the like some of the powerful war scrolls you have available, are they something you can take to fit the requirements of the army? If they are, they're no longer attacks, right? They're basically synergistically fitting into your power scope, your efficiency frontier. So that's a work term. But they're incredibly, like, that's what you want to fit is those units. And like I'll give you an example for instead of just talking around, like Fire Slayers, which is one of the guys behind me here. They are effectively at face value before you take into consideration any sub factions and things. Their battle line options, which is a requirement, are Volkites with double weapons, Volkites with shield and weapon. Volkites are a pretty expensive unit. They have some value. They fit definitely that board control piece. They have little to no destructive power. And they have, and through the other ways, they have some minor recursion. But is it the best war scroll in the book? By far not. Like, it's probably the worst war scroll in the book. Arguably, I mean, some people would disagree with that, but I would argue in terms of like, if I can make an army of nothing but, Grimrafts, I'd probably take that over Volkites. So, which I guess I have, but the moral of the story is that like I don't necessarily like it's is the requirements an effective tax, or is it an efficiency addition to your army, right? There's another army that does the same problem. There's like for more recent terminology, the Flesh Eater Court. Basically, Flesh Eater Courts only have one battle line option, which is the ghouls. And ghouls, great board control, mediocre destructive power, also have recursions. It's just another kind of like example of a Fire Slayer Volkites. But if I put the two together in a vacuum, right, like would I rather have 10 Volkites or 20 ghouls? Like just literally war scroll to war scroll. It's arguable that the Volkites will beat out the ghouls in combat, but is it like necessarily the only way you're supposed to analyze this? No. Like there's all these other pieces that come together, and we'll talk about them as we go down the chapters. But like you can't just evaluate a war scroll to war scroll like just like that. But it is important to denote that like you have to understand like one of the biggest power advantage for any Battletome is that your taxes are actually your tax units are not tax units. They actually play to the game role that your list design and army design is, or list archetype is going for. any book that doesn't basically let you do that, it's already arguably starting the game, or in our argument, already a foot, 2 feet, or whatever backwards. I'm trying to think of a book that has effectively kind of stuck in that framework. I think Slaves of Darkness is probably the one that comes to mind the most. um it's because Chaos Warriors and Chaos Knights, as well as Chaos Chariots, are like the really only battle line option before anything else. Like you do anything else, like tough actions and all that stuff, they're like on paper like valuable, but the point cost they're all in is makes them very hard to say that like they're not attacks effectively. I think you don't really see a true traditional Slaves of Darkness that isn't like using Varangard as battle lines or Cultists as battle lines, or but those things, like if you do like an army of nothing but like just starting with the minimum costed one, 3 independent chariots, that's like a 240 points, right, or something. Oh, like that's a fairly big amount. That's like what, 18, 17.5% of your army just basically dedicated to 3 chariots that like literally will do probably jack all the entire game in terms like they don't have great board control. They don't have a lot of destructive power, and they have 0 recursion. So I think in that regard, Slaves of Darkness is probably the one army that like suffers the most out of, well, at least in this example, suffers the most from like basically they're truly paying a tax for these units, even if they go the cheapest option possible. Now you could argue, well, Chaos Warriors are pretty good. They're pretty good on their own. Yeah, they're better than Chariots, but at the same point, like now you need 3 units of Chaos Warriors, and you're down like what, like let's say like almost what, 40% of your list is gone. Like, so like that's the thing, is like battleline requirements are either like, and you're not going to make an army of just Chaos Warriors. I think that's like kind of the point, right? Like you're going to take other things other than Chaos Warriors to flesh out your list, because you need to fit, you need to get actually draw some power from somewhere, and it's not Chaos Warriors. So what ends up happening is if you dedicate 40% of your list to just Chaos Warriors, then because you've taken 3 units, mid-sized units, and like you've already sacrificed so much power on the table for that. And that's the point, right? You want to consider like armies that have effectively battle line requirements, or whatever requirement you're supposed to take, that are not attacks. Wow, that was a long way of going about. So probably some knowledge that everybody on the internet probably knows, but we got to start somewhere here on this basis. All right, then the last piece of this chapter that I think I'm going to spend some time discussing is what kind of army we're looking at, right? So now we've basically discerned where they sit on the Fitch battle profile army restriction. We've discerned like which which war scrolls are very powerful, and then now you're kind of putting them together, and you're coming up with some loose amalgamation of like what an army could look like for your tome. And now we gotta look at these profiles of like overall, like what does this army look like. I'm sorry. uh are we looking at an army with like 180 plus wounds? Are we looking at an army of less than 80 wounds? um what's the overall save, movement? How much does it need command abilities, or how does it play in the command ability economy of the game? But like all of these things become now basically not just an abstract question about specific war scrolls and where it fits in the army restrictions, but also like once you put some kind of loose obligation together, like what are we actually looking at? And the reason why this is important is because we're going to go in chapter 2 to talk about allegiance and sub allegiances, and those are important for knowing what kind of army look you have. It's going to play a huge role into making a decision like, is this a good army or not, through the Battletome, because it plays into the gimmick of like, are you being rewarded for making these decisions by your allegiance mechanics. So you know there's a big part of like, a tome can have great powerful war scrolls, and you put and maybe even like not even any taxes in terms of unit selection, and then you put them all together, or you start making a list, and all of a sudden you land into something that really doesn't vibe with the overall allegiance of the army. And I'm trying to like, I was actually thinking about this earlier. But like, there's an example of an army that like fits that. Um, I think like in some sense, like Beast of Chaos fit that in a little bit. It's the army wants to be this kind of like hard hitting, better strike, kind of like ambushy army. But then when you look at like all the pieces that fit together, uh, it doesn't really like it doesn't apply much more pressure than the first better strike it does. And I think that's like effectively one of the major problems with like how that army operates. And this isn't ignoring like a lot of things about like the allegiances and so forth. I'm just saying like face value. When you think about that army, you're thinking about hey, they have like some minutia, tax units requirement, and then like they play their entire identity as this ambusher army, and then they ambush, and that's it, like that one time ambush. Like it really feels like you put all these war scrolls together, you're getting like in some cases like 100 wound army because you're probably taking Bulgors or Discus Zinch, and you're thinking like, man, like that still doesn't look like the right amount of models for how the army operates on the table. And that's like questions like that you have to like basically pose yourself about how does this army wants to overall play and how does it fit its profiles and identity when it actually puts together. Um, I think I'm trying to think of another. I guess maybe uh, you know Deepkin plays that way too. Suffers a bit of that syndrome as well, especially but this is more reactionary for Games Workshop from how dominant the eel spam was. I'm gonna have a bit of a sip here. It's talking for almost 30 minutes. Uh, it's just we're talking about an army that basically had an identity built around uh, being an elite army with the potential of being a spam or horde army, but medium spam, I would say medium horde, not really full horde. And then like over the additional, over what actually transpired, it was not at all what it turned into that to be, right? It's just turned into something completely different than I don't think Games Workshop really intended the army to operate into, then fit its identity, right? But what does that have to do with like pitch battle profile and like war scrolls? It's the problem like these books have um very few actually taken war scroll, right? Like when you look into Deepkin, first they have very few war scrolls. I guess same with Fire Slayers, and in comparison to other books. And when you do look at like or Beast of Chaos, when you look at their war scrolls, it's very few are taken. So there's effectively a problem of like they've spent a lot. When you think about it, they spent a lot of energy writing these rules for across all of these different war scrolls, but unfortunately they missed the mark in terms of like what we just discussed overall. But it's in there these are they competing with each other in terms of like these war scrolls? Are they competing against each other for basically doing the same thing? And once they compete for doing the same thing, you're always going to gravitate to the one that's just effectively a little bit more efficient than the other one, right? You're never going to take a war scroll that does. You're not going to Highlander, take one of everything army. Like it's rarely ever seen in AOS. And that's kind of like I think the problem with like some of the army designs that when you look into uh, how they're being released, especially ones of like Cruel Boys, for example. There's very few war scroll options, right? And at least to the part, I would say to the outside of the kill bow, I think pretty much everything a Cruel Boy unit in a Cruel Boy army makes it into the book, right? Or in the army. You usually have some kind of vulture model. You have a swamp shaman. You might not have the boss or the banner, but you'll have like the gut rippers and you'll have the bolt skewers. And in that sense, like it's already like, hey, it's using about 80% of its worth, and hobgrots, it's gonna eating 80% of its units, right? So I mean, it honestly doesn't really have a choice, right? Like if there was a unit in that book that was basically a better version of gut rippers in terms of at least destructive power, I think most, or at least more, or like more durable, I think more people would just take that version, even though it hit less as hard. So anyway, I'm rambling on about well, let's go back to the original, kind of like where I was going before I went on this tangent here, which is effectively when you put all these things together, what are you looking at and how does it look right? Does it feel right? when you put lists together on paper, I it's hard to necessarily understand if that looks right or bad if you don't have the models, which is why I recommend anybody who hasn't use TTS might want to use TTS to at least just not even use them to play the game, but like literally like when you design a list, just like put up the models, like go find the models, just put them together, put them in a, and just take a look at it, and you're like, huh, this is, it says 120 wounds, but it doesn't feel like 120 wounds on the table. So, that's the first gut check that like you need kind of like have before you jump into like the allegiance mechanic. Like, I'm not saying you should, completely, disregard the army right out of the gate, but if something on paper you think in your head does something or should look like something, and then you put it on the table and it does not look like that, then by design it's already kind of like a strike against the army before you take into consideration everything else, right? It's just kind of like, well, that doesn't feel right. So that's chapter one. War scrolls and pitch battle profile. I'm trying to make that as agnostic as I said, for edition, so I didn't go into specific like, hey, you should take a look, you should only consider armies with units with like 5 wounds and like move 8 inches. Like, no. Like, trying to get you guys to like gravitate toward an abstract level of understanding too, so before you like, take me at like some kind of formulaic gospel and then just say, well, Jeremy said you're supposed to take units which are around 120 points with 12 wounds, which like, no, we're not doing that. So anyway, that's it for chapter one. We're gonna move straight into chapter two here in a second. Okay, now for chapter two. Let's get this party started. Sorry, I had to get some water, get rehydrated. We still got 2 other chapters to go after this one, so it's gonna be a while. Okay, so let's talk about allegiance and sub-allegiances. Now, one of the core concepts around allegiances that we basically talked about in the War Scroll that matters the most is, once again, how do these allegiances affect the board control, destructive power, and recursion pillars of any army, right? So, I'll give you an example for an allegiance mechanic that affects board control. Might is right ear, or whatever. Might is right. And might ear is right ear. That's right. Which is the ogre and the giants thing. Right away, this is an allegiance mechanic that affects board control. It's very powerful, very good for lots of reasons. Now, in terms of destructive power, we could look at like factions or sub-faction mechanics that have like give you like, more ability to do hit better when they trigger things, whatever. There's lots of reasons. Or mechanically allegiance mechanics that like grant out like effectively destructive power. I think that's a very obvious one you'll see in a lot. And then the recursion and resistance, obviously like death as, kind of like the blanket 6-up ward mechanic on top of the recursions usually those armies get in some form or another. But in terms of other books, recursion from the allegiance could be like let's see, like having a certain like ward save if you're sitting on an objective, like things like that. Like, right, it's just basically stickiness and so forth. So right at the gate, like the allegiance mechanic that effectively are the more valuable ones are the ones that are usually traditionally affect one of those 3 things. And once again, priority is still the same, right? It's all about board control first, right? And like, all 3 while doing it in some way or another, whatever combination gets you to do the most is what makes the book the best, or better or good. In terms of, when you're looking at these allegiance mechanics, you really want to pick the one from the context of vacuum of, or not the context, not a vacuum, it's within the realm of the other allegiance mechanics available in the current environment, right? If those allegiance mechanics are just doing these things vastly better than the rest of the environment or the rest of the books available right now, then effectively that this is already starting to be a pretty good army, right? You've just spent the time analyzing war scrolls and where they fit in the pitch battle profile, and now you're looking at the allegiance and you're like, oh man, it's really also helping me in these sectors or these environments. Now, keep in context that like there's also downsides to this. what if the allegiance mechanics are restrictive, right? There's a lot of armies that have like allegiance mechanics. I'll think of like the 2.0 goblins, probably the most egregious one. But in today's worlds, we have Skaven, which are, so mechanically speaking, their allegiance mechanics are tied to very specific keywords or war scrolls. Anything that's restrictive is already, it kind of dilutes the power of the allegiance, right? Unless, of course, your army is designed around only those units, right? So then it doesn't really matter. It might as well just, be the same, right? But if you have an army where basically you're taking like these, like we talked about the tax units of army restriction, and then on top of that, the allegiance doesn't even really benefit them, then like you're really like now like effectively paying this incredibly tax premium, because fundamentally you can think of it as like the first chapter is about like the core basis of what you're building. This chapter is about like the first layer you're putting on top of it. And if you're basically that layer you're putting on top of it only fits a small portion or a smaller portion than the total amount of base you have, then it's not necessary. It'd have to be an incredibly powerful allegiance mechanic to basically be that convenient or good, because the difference in power for those units available is just like, once again, it's a triangulation point of efficiency between volume and quality, right? So yeah, like if the allegiance mechanic is not restrictive, it's powerful. It's already started right at the gate, already becoming effectively a good. It's a good battle attack, or sorry, not battle attack. Take a good allegiance. Getting forward for myself because that's the next chapter. Now, additionally, like any book, you have to think about like, are the allegiance mechanic that I'm getting effectively counterable, or like and we're talking really about a range, right? It's not just like are they counterable because I have ward mechanics and my opponent has mechanics that turn off wards. Like that's, you have to think about like how easily that mechanic sequence can happen. Like, is it like a spell, so it requires some dice roll? Is it anything, or is it like just melee? Is it shooting? Is it like things were really, by the end of the day, is that like our allegiance mechanics like effectively, you know, um, going to be countered by your opponent relatively easily, or through a much more complex steps of sequences, and thus like it doesn't really matter. It's not. It's good for your opponent to have that in his toolkit, but it's also mechanically, structurally, probably not consistent enough to go off and impede you. So like when I think about like allegiance mechanics that are countable, right? Like if you had like battle line or units that just count as more models and objective, like let's say the Illumina sub-faction. Well, it's not allegiance specific, we'll talk about sub-factions a bit later, but like Illumina get like these extra model count, and as long as they're basically in Shining Company, and you play against an army that turns off scoring for one wounded models, like through an artifacts or something, then, well, surprise, you like now that's very easily countable. But like here's another example of like degrees of counterability. What if you're playing against Cities of Sigmar and they have the ogre Hulk guy who gets to, maybe when he rolls crackshot rule, which he gets to pick up models to, and then he can remove models out of your unit to be no longer in Shining Company, then you lose that, right? But that's rolling sixes, required to roll sixes, and might need more than 1/6 to do it based on like how you deployed your unit. So fairly unlikely, right? So like there's these kind of things which are important to take, right? Countering teching against your opponent, or what possibly is the overall environment, is important, but it has to be in a way where it's achievable, because if it's not, then it's just really too, it's never going to be consistent enough to make a difference overall, like like an event, or your campaign or whatever, right? So allegiance mechanic have to be effectively not counterable, or not easily counterable by player agency. That includes like list design, decisions at the table, whatever. But also they also have to be not countable through army matchups or mission design, right? Like there are some some missions in the wide range of GHBs we've gotten, which basically literally punish armies that don't have effectively these like elite, like these mechanics or certain types of mechanics. Like let's say like one of your allegiance mechanic is fly, and you play Frigid Zephyr. Nothing has fly until the Zephyr goes down. So like things like I mean, this is a reductive example, but it's just like literally the point is allegiance mechanics that are unconstrained effectively by player decisions or potentially matchups you're going to play into are, what you're looking for, right, as a basis for, effectively this is going to be good. Now, there are allegiance mechanics which are counterable, but because they're better than that basis level we set, there's an argument to be made that, like, well, they're even more attractive to take, right? They're more attractive to take because the level in which they can be countable are so low odds or so minute that I'd rather take the power advantage than that. But that's really more of like a player decision, and there's no right way of doing it or wrong way of doing it. But fundamentally, it comes down to like how much does it benefit that base that you built, right? Which is that War Scroll combination. If you need to basically have it be act as a force multiplier to your base, right? So the power you're getting or the efficiency you're getting out of your base needs to be effectively exponential right out of the gate with the allegiance mechanics. Um, and then on top of that, like then there's a sub faction like criteria, right? So sub factions are interesting because they went from and this is good by the way, historically speaking, they went, and this is also similar for 40k. They went from if allegiance a page to sub factions also a page of rules, and then all of a sudden you had 2 pages of rules, and now they've not necessarily reduced the quantity of rules, but what they have done is they gave the allegiance more rules or more scope, I would say, and then they've reduced the sub factions to paragraph. And what it does is it basically we're playing in an edition where the era of one sub faction ruling one tome is becoming less and less prevalent, and most people are taking multiple types of sub faction because they've designed sub factions to enable certain types of archetype play or list design. And this is why we go back and personally for me, like what a good book is a book that opens up multiple list archetype before anything else. But then, obviously sub factions kind of like basically force it into that. There's also an argument that like, unfortunately, the sub factions also can be, problematic where there's only one good archetype in the book anyway. And then there's the reason why is because the sub faction rules or the allegiance rules or combination of both basically just blows it up in power effectively. Because like I said, we're looking for multiplication here from the base to this, right? When you jump from the base to the allegiance, you want effectively like 2x power value right out of the gate from having that. So you got your list, but your allegiance adds double the value of your army effectively at the table. In terms of like artifacts, command traits, and so forth, spells, prayers, terrain feature, and I'm going to sideline terrain features for a bit because I honestly like there's not even really a decision to be made about them most of the time. They're just there. You just have them. Now, I would arguably say I will revisit this topic later in the last chapter, but for now we're going to sidestep it from here. In terms of artifact and command trait, the point of decision shouldn't be about like, oh man, this sub faction has really cool artifact, or oh man, this sub faction is a really cool command trait. The real like point of decision regarding that space is how much of a force multiplication is it going to enable? Is like we're really looking for that. Like, so if you have an army that's basically, let's say, like mechanically does mortal wounds on the charge, well, you're looking for things that improve your charge. You're looking at things that improve your mortal wound output. You're looking for like anything that basically guarantees you're going to get the charge. So things that like do retreat and charge or enable that or do 3d6, like things like all these things about mechanically speaking are anything to help you benefit from this. And here's an example like Nighthawk, right? Like Nighthawk has the generic, basically, or not generic, but like as a universal retreat and charge rule. So any kind of things that basically give them the reroll because it plays into their allegiance mechanic of Wave of Terror, I believe it's called, where they trigger mechanics on the charge. You're looking, you're digging deeper in that value pocket or value prop of your allegiance, basically. So artifacts and command trait need to be around, multiplying your allegiance mechanics, not necessarily just like a, oh, this command trait and this artifact combination makes this one unit or one model, more powerful. While it is valuable for sure, it's not necessarily the type of multiplication you're looking for in terms of value, if you can avoid that. And since this is a discussion in a context of like evaluating an entire book by itself, versus like all the other books, that's like literally what you're looking for. It's like, how many opportunities am I given in that allegiance decision to multiply the base that I've created or the base I want to play with first. Like look at Flesh Eater Court right now as a more recent example. You're basically like, if you want to play the night list of Flesh Eater Court, you're going to play Hollowmorn. Why? Because Hollowmorn just adds more value. Like it's just a value equation. And that's an easy one to make a decision of. Is that like comparably, Hollowmorn is a much more powerful faction than like let's say in the Cities book than Misthaven? Arguably, I probably would say no, right? Because Misthaven gives you like this hero phase move, which plays way more into the board control equation, and as well you could argue plays more into the recursion defensive role, because you can manage ranges better to keep away from opponent. And while the Hollowmorn mechanic plays more into that just straight raw destructive power output, which is, while good, doesn't necessarily, it's also very conditional new charging, which is a whole another thing, like when we talked about being like, is it easily counterable or not? So anyway, the whole point of the the argument I'm making here is like, allegiance are important and they need to be explicitive in multiplying your army. I think the one that I think in the original first books they did this for 3.0 between Stormcast and Orange and the Orc War Clan, you could really tell that like the allegiance mechanics were still kind of trailing the 2.0 edition, because when you look at like, for example, Ironjawz, the Mighty Destroyer mechanic is so fundamentally a core aspect of that army. It doesn't even operate, I think, if you remove it from the equation. If you remove Mighty Destroyer from Ironjawz, I think it is fundamentally like a much worse army. And it's the same for a lot of the other like other options in the Orc War Clan book. And then for Stormcast, you can kind of like, you get the opposite end of the spectrum, where if you remove the Scions, the army kind of still operates. There's some archetypes that still operate, not necessarily good, but like they still operate. So maybe I'm wrong in that assessment. Then Scions is like a super important part of it. Also, it's part of the identity of the army, so you can remove it. But anyway, the point I was making is allegiance mechanics that function as multipliers are very important. What else I want to say about allegiance? I feel like I'm forgetting something important. I'm sure I'll come back later when I'm doing the next chapter. Sorry, guys. Or I'll edit it in. But for the most part, yeah, like, hit on the points again. You want allegiance mechanics and inherently impact the game through board control destructive power or recursion / defensive power, stickiness of your base, multiply that aspect of your army. You're looking for it to be non-restrictive as much as possible, and you're looking for them to be non-counterable by your opponent's decision or matchups, right? Those are the three vectors in allegiance and sub-faction allegiance you're effectively looking to maximize on. So if when you're reading the book for the first time and you're putting in the context of all the other books available around, that's like, if it's hitting all these things, then it's like, okay, that's a really good allegiance, like, effectively right at the gate, right? I mean, obviously there's wide range of degrees of that, but like if you can start at least at that level, then you're doing great. All right, well, that chapter was a lot faster than I was expecting. Thank God. Okay. Now we're gonna go into chapter 3, which is battle tactics and grand strategy. I'll preface this to say that like I've talked about this section all across all my other videos a lot. So if this is repetitive for a lot of my the folks listening, then yeah, please skip over it. But you're gonna hear me talk about path to victory and like all that stuff that I hit on all the time. about like battle tactic scripting and so forth that are, you know, we're just going to hit on again because it's part of the entire video. So going right into it. You know, it's kind of like the same thing that's been kind of like I touched on a little bit earlier, like battle tactics for Battletomes, assuming we're keeping that around for fourth edition, are ways of scoring points. Let's describe them that way because fundamentally that's what they are. The ways unlocked to the player to score points, they're really hard to balance for, you know, Games Workshop, because in some regards they're using it as a way to maybe perhaps overcome some deficiency that a book or, you know, in the previous two chapter has, by giving them the ability to have an easier path of victory than others. Because if your army is incredibly good and powerful, and like you have a solid base, you have an incredibly powerful allegiance mechanic, and you're just basically like, you know, you're just at the table, you're just, you know, pardon the French, big dicking it effectively, but your battle tactics are terrible and your path to victory is awful, then you're not going to win games. Or at least very hard. You're probably looking at a 3-2-2-3, maybe 1-5 situation. It doesn't matter how powerful like those two things are if your path to victory is completely like a barrier to entry. Like so, and sometimes I feel like they've treated battle tactics and grand strategy as a way to maybe even balance off the other problems that some of these books are. And then with the way the GHBs rotate and the new set of battle tactics and redesign and new mechanics and new allegiance mechanics, in a sense, right? Seasonal mechanics are basically just another allegiance mechanic. Then you're getting into situations where there's an evolving landscape in which like armies that work great one edition don't operate in the next edition just because their path to points. Like you could get rid of the seasonal rules, like the whole primal dice blizzard, all that stuff from this GHB, and then look at like the missions and battle tactics available from like the first GHB of 3.0 to this one, and you can tell easily that like some armies would have been great in one point in the first GHB, are probably pretty decent in this GHB, in the last GHB, and then this GHB are terrible. And that's just because the way they've designed the path to victory on how to score points became a lot less, I would say, easy. And also they also kind of hard coded them beyond, made them a little bit more restrictive. So a book that is incredibly resilient to this landscape of GHB changes is a book that has at least 3 battle tactics available to them from their Battletome that's incredibly easy for them to do, right? Like, or is doable from the framework that how this is how the list plays or the army plays, right? This is something you're going to do anyway, and then you're just getting points for it effectively. And in that regard, like, you know, if you want to be able to, you know, in the first book of Battletome of 4th edition, with whatever the new GHB is, we'll have no idea necessarily at face value if it's going to be good or not, but it's going to be the only one. So it's going to be good by default, you imagine, versus the index hammer. So, you know, it's going to take a while before we see like how the resetting of the balance, you know, is going to come around regarding that space. But, you know, let's focus on the core, you know, what makes battle tactics good and grand strats good for a Battletome comparison to others. You know, firstly, when we hit back on like the thing we talked about, legions, they're not restrictive. Like one of the biggest, I think, gripe I've had with OBR when it first came out was that the battle tactics weren't actually hard to do, but they were all very unit locked specific. So what ended up happening is like, unless you were going to effectively build a Highlander OBR army, because that's the only thing you could do to basically have the opportunity to score all 5 of them, you effectively like could only score maybe 1 or 2. But 1 or 2 is usually good enough as long as you can score the GHB ones fairly easily. So they're a pretty okay battle tactics. Are they the best ones available? Hell no, right? Like there are books out there whose battle tactic options are incredibly nuts and easy, right? Well, let's talk about the Lumineth one. The Lumineth one, you know, are incredibly easy. They just synergize what you're trying to do with the book anyway, and some, you know, some are obviously easier than others, but you have like 4 battle tactics out of that tome, I believe, that every Lumineth player has a shot of doing, even if they're not designing their armies in this very specific way, like not necessarily keyword locked, right? Now, barring, of course, if you decide to play an army of Lumineth with no wizard, then it gets a little bit more tricky. But like, but the thing is, like we talked about right before, like you're building this base and you're taking this allegiance to multiply it, and now you have effectively a path to victory open to you that is effectively agnostic of really the decisions you made previously, right? Uh, and battle tactics that impact decisions of design of the player are fundamentally worse than battle tactics that don't, right? Because now you're forced to take these units, and if you're lucky enough that these units are the one you need to take or want to take to be good, to have a good army, then great. But at face value, in a vacuum, those are worse off than battle tactics where you don't need to take units, these specific units, to do it. So battle tactics which are restricted in restricted in access are bad, to a varying degree, right? Okay, now let's talk about like achievability of battle tactics. So there's multiple schools of thoughts into this, but really boils down to I'd arguably say that if a battle tactic can be done without your opponent doing anything or being able to do something, or you can basically remove your opponent's ability to counter that battle tactic, is probably the most battle for the battle tactic. We'll talk some easy ones, right? Like in this current GHB, we have Intimidate Invaders. Intimidate Invaders requires you to do, a set of decisions at the table, which your opponent really typically doesn't have control over stopping you from doing. And thus, like, it is a very easy battle tactic. Magical Dominance is a very easy battle tactic, but it is risky because there's something your opponent can do to stop it. And thus, like, it is, that is a riskier battle tactic. But then there's battle tactics like led into the Maelstrom, which are also fairly easy from the GHB, but like mechanically, your opponent can pull out models in a way to punish you for it. So like I'm giving you like GHB examples without giving specific faction ones, but like the faction ones vary in degrees of that same range of complexity and achievability, right? Effectively, any battle tactics that lets you do something without involving your opponent, or basically knowing your opponent's involvement, like brute forcing it through, is effectively a very powerful battle tactic, right? Because you're always looking to score points, irregardless of what your opponent can do about it. The instant your opponent, or dice maybe to an extent, gets involved, like especially battle tactics which are revolved around charges, is always kind of a funky one. It's always kind of a risky one because between redeploys, and I know I use lead as an example, it's probably the riskier one of all the three, but like redeploys plus also dice rolls, it makes it challenging, it makes it risky. It doesn't become as easy as possible. Even Magical Dominance, right, is challenging because you could do miscast and all of a sudden, like, there it goes. But that's the point, though. You have to work if you have access to battle tactics like Intimidate the level complex, Intimidate Invader level easy, and you have two of those right at the gate, your book is already like, your path to victory is very easy. I think they're probably the best army in terms of an example of non-interactive and easy some battle tactics are, is probably Daughters of Cain, right? Because they have Fire and Flight, which is bring down some 2 units of canaries and either charge and fight, which is the harder version, or you can just do the shooty ones, shoot, and then they do their mechanic, and then boom, you scored your battle tactic. And then I believe they have another one that's effectively like make 3 charges, but they're like, it's pretty easy for that army to make charges because they're looking at +1, and they all have like run and charge, and like, so they can get very close no matter what redeploys. Like, I don't know, there's like, I feel like there's way more easy, like there's other easier battle tactics in that book other than the one I just listed. But like, it's for the most part like things that like effectively like don't require your opponent's interactions too much, right? And God, I think one of them used to even give an extra bonus points too, which was not something cool. So glad they got rid of bonus points. And then there's I think an example of the other end of the spectrum, I think is Skaven is probably the worst one in terms of battle tactic options. mostly because they're all effectively kind of like not keyword lock, but like pseudo subfaction lock, and it's not and like you to participate in all the options of battle tactic. I think it's impossible to build a list that can do all of the battle tactics in Skaven, and it's like suffers the same syndrome OBR has, but like I think made it impossible for you to do all. You can do maybe two or three, and even then they're all fairly kind of challenging to do. Like getting like was it like three prayers off in a turn is what sounds pretty good. It's really like it's pretty risky to do, especially early in the game before you get the reroll prayer from the Great Plague. Like for the most part, I would arguably say like maybe Skaven on the other end of the spectrum is the hardest. Talking about Grand Strat now, very similar, topic, right? Grand strategies are suffer the same symptom as effectively battle tactics. It's just it's just more of a long run battle tactics. So grand strategies which are character keyword locked are not necessarily good. Just like battle tactics which are keyword locked or restricted. The most important one of the grand strategy, though, it needs to be something that can be done without depending on your opponent's ability to kill things. So like usually battle tactic or grand strategies which are like have something in middle of the board that's that's okay, but the instant it's like the GHB one have two wizards in middle of the board, well, you better hope you have a lot of wizards because if you only have like two or three, your opponent's going to probably spend most of their energy trying to kill at least one or two of them, right? in the game. So like I like control the Nexus, which is the grand strat I've listed, but I also fully recognize that it's can be a very challenging grand strat because it involves throughout the game a lot of counterability by my opponent as the game basically progresses. So my job is to make sure he cannot counter it as much as possible. But grand strats like the Dock one, which is basically everybody fights or dies, awesome. Super easy, and it plays completely into their playstyle. Though it is funny trying. I've played Doc a couple times when I'm trying to basically throw the one known hack queen on foot into combat, like throughout the game, like like just rushing down the field, or even trying to get her killed by filling prayers, or like trying to take damn terrain and deadly terrain tests, or trying to kill herself just so she can achieve their grand strat. But like, which is from a design perspective, for me it's like that seems silly. Like why? Okay. And then there's all the other grand strats like the Fire Slayer one, which is have an incantation on the table by the end of the game. That's like in a period of 2.0, it was like basically a give me. Like it was just like no one really took priests at some point, part of the game, so like they were never removed. Like so it was effective give me. Like there's definitely grand strats like that where you're looking for in a book design. If you see a grand strat that basically is like at that level of difficulty, you're having a great pathway to victory. So hitting that back though to the beginning of that comment about, hey, like what makes a great book in terms of battle tactics and grand strategy or just path to victory, it's the ones that basically reward you for giving you points for doing the things your list's army's already going to be doing. So there's no real focus into basically making these taxing decisions, either be taking certain units to make it happen, or like effectively making it challenging or very counterable by your opponent. I think Feck, in a sense, kind of plays this weird like middle ground between those two in terms of balance. Like so hear me talk about, but it's just a good example of like, hey, if you have a tome that has one grand strat that basically like the Dock one, which is it just executes the plan you're already trying to do at the table, and then you have battle tactics which are effectively just exist, like do things and exist, and it's just incredibly powerful. It's also very boring, but it's incredibly powerful for you in terms of like recognizing like, hey, like now I got this solid base, I have this multiplicative effect that happens on the top, and then I have a path to victory that is effectively unrestrictive, unconstrained by affect my opponent as much as possible, right? So you put all these two together, or these three together, and you're having what we're talking about the last chapter, which is cheating value. Cheating value. What is cheating value? Cheating value is basically the culmination of what we just spent the last 4 chapters talking about. I try to silo them all in one, all in an equation, but effectively cheating value is that X factor where every decision you made across army combination, allegiance pick, sub allegiance pick, warlord trait, command trait, artifact, relic, when you put all of these together, it effectively creates a massive exponential bonus across all of them of cheating value. I have a very solid example for what I mean by that. I'm sorry, I am not picking on the Seraphon world, but I was influenced by Spoom for basically, telling, TLDR, the video is just play Seraphon is basically the consensus. But, there's he's right about that, right? The video is about explaining all the reasons why a book is good, and I'm about to talk about Starborn. And I'm even going to talk about the sub faction because it really doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, it's going to be Fangs of Sotek. So, but it is, it is like that's the clearest elimination of what makes a book great, or even the best. Arguably, in a sense, in terms of balance and power and so forth, or ill balance in this sense, right? So let's start with like effectively, going through the chapter and how this is creating what I call cheating value, or your cheating value at the table. Basically, when you're showing up and you want to play Starborn, or you're playing Starborn, you're looking at the war scrolls available to you, and you're like, okay, well, these my battle line requirements are effectively some bodyguards and some source warriors and maybe some skinks. They all have I would arguably say like the Seraphon book has effectively probably, some of the, in the current edition, some of the most taxes available to some of the more competitive books. But Source Warriors and Source Guards are fantastic war scrolls. They're tanky, they have multi wounds, they have like an okay output for the point cost. Like anyway, they're just like, they're good on paper. Now the downside is their attacks, and they don't necessarily play with the other the chapter 2 piece, right? And then like you're looking at Crook, like incredibly powerful wizard. You have Slan, also incredibly powerful. Oh man, this guy lets you effectively turn off wards. That's also really good. Plays into that destructive power. Oh man, and this guy lets you give like some mortal wound output and like more destructive power. And then they're like, okay, like, well, how does this army play in board control? Oh, not great. But then, in recursion, not great either at face value, like, right, just straight from the war scrolls. But, you got a good base of power. And you're like, okay, now in the next step, it's like, oh, I have an idea of like what I want to do with it. And then you look at like, because, the identity is like spacefaring wizards, lizards, wizard lizards, and now you're looking at like the allegiance, and you're like, okay, Starborn, honestly, it doesn't matter between Kotal's Claw or Fangs of Sotek, but probably Fangs of Sotek, probably the easiest value you get out of it. And then all of a sudden, like, the pieces of the engine just start making sense, right? Like you're maybe lacking in that recursion. Well, guess what? You have summoning. You have maybe same mechanic that lets you summon can also give you 5-up ward, but from your banner or whatever. Like you're starting to see the pieces fit into like how this army basically has an engine for board control, destructive power, and recursion all simultaneously inside this package. And then you're making all of these decisions about list design around how do I basically take this 4-cylinder engine and turn it into a 12-cylinder engine. That's kind of like what the Seraphon process was, right? They have this incredibly powerful allegiance mechanic with some basically lots of board control tools. The teleportation is massive, the summoning is massive, the destructive power through like all of the mortal wound output they can generate, and the cleanse the realm mechanic. And even, I said I was going to sidestep terrain features towards the end. Like their realm shaper engine also has a ton of destructive output, basically by pinging units near terrain. Like they're all of a sudden like, okay, we're checking the box on destructionists, we're checking the box on board control, and we're checking the box on recursion because they have great synergy in summoning. They can be fairly sticky. At least the people driving the engine can be fairly sticky because now your tax unit of Saurus Temple Guard are now basically acting as ablative wounds for your engine. Like it's you're hitting like you're bam bam bam, just adding more and more. Like you're effectively creating some kind of symphony out of like the Seraphon book. And it doesn't stop there. Then you have your command traits and your artifact. And your command trait, well, at least even with the fact, it's still really good. It's just feeding that engine more. Every time you successfully cast a spell, you get an extra summoning point. You also get an extra summoning point for the first time you dispel or unbind a spell, I believe. And on top of that, like you're playing around all of these heroes who are also passively generating summoning points at the start of your hero phase. Like it's just like you can kind of just see like every decision in that list is made around like feeding that engine, feeding it more, constantly feeding it more. And even though the army is very small, it operates at a level that like most armies cannot, right? Because that engine gets fed to a level of degree that it cheats so much value at the table. And that's what makes it tick, right? It is that level of cheating that makes it tick. It's just incredible, like that after all of these editions of Seraphon, they're still making the first casual mistake they've ever made with Seraphon, which is that they've over-indexed, especially for Starborn, on that engine, that whole mechanical engine, that the way the army plays. And they still haven't quite figured out how to basically enable, because unfortunately the Starborn side has a very limited list archetype design options because the engine is so tuned to operate in this framework. So that's the only way it gets operated. Now it's not undefeatable. Like you can defeat Seraphon. It's not like, but at face value, when you read that book and you read those allegiance and you read how everything comes together, you're like, holy shit. This thing just like it's basically driving a fucking V12, except the downside is you're also you're in a drag race competition. Like so those cars are sometimes a little bit faster than you because you were designed for corners and everything is designed for fucking straight speed, right? Straight down speed. But it's not saying like Seraphon's bad, guys. Seraphon, I think Starborn, everybody knows, is good. But this is like the best example I can show you of an army that effectively is so fine-tuned to cheating value out of all of those core concepts we've talked about. And even the battle tactics in Grand Strats. Now, the Grand Strats are a little bit more difficult for Starborn, but the battle tactics are pretty good. They have effectively magical mayhem in their own book. They also have taking objective away from your opponent with just skinks that they can just summon. Like they have good, solid battle tactic options. Even though the skink one is keyword locked, so it is restrictive, but since you can just kind of summon one on the table, it's like, it's like you don't really need to bring skinks when you come to army design concepts. So cheating value is the biggest part, I would say, about the culmination of all of this conversation I'm having with you guys is that when you know a book is good at face value, it's because you can see all of the ways it cheats value at the table. And the more it cheats values, the better the book will operate. It is still bounded by its path to victory limitations, but if it can play around that, the book that has the most cheating value possible is going to be the better book. So when you look at your first Battletome or your indexes for 4.0, and you're going through your war scrolls and your whatever allegiance they give us, just focus on understanding how systematically all of these things generate and become multiplier on top of each other. And once again, I don't think I'm repeating anything new, but I'm just codifying it into a video, I guess, that most people have quite figured out. Just cheat value. Try to find ways to cheat value. And the more often you cheat value, the better your performance will be at the table. Because, you know, if you were going to use the, example of like what it means fundamentally in a metaphor, somebody showed up with, you know, 20% of cheating value, so he's playing with 2,400 points. You showed up with 80% of cheating value, so you showed up with, you know, 3,000 plus points or whatever. Like, so yeah, at some level or another, like just straight advantage of power is just gonna, power push through, right? Like obviously there's lots of things that's not accounting for like what happens in the table, but for the most part, just immediately from the get go, yeah, it's good. It's why for a long time in 2.0, the best in 1.0 to an extent, the best armies were the ones who were cheating the value in the most obvious way. Slanesh by summoning basically almost 2,000 points to the table. Flesh Eater Court by summoning almost 2,000 points to the table. Like any army that like effectively had these basic or original def, I think where you could command point a whole unit back on the table, like mechanically speaking, that was the easiest example of cheating value, but it wasn't with so many steps. Now they've basically identified, they made it harder for folks to identify how to cheat value. And obviously people like me and other players are always keeping an eye out on how finding new ways to cheat value out of everything, right? And I know cheating is not the word probably want to hear people for here. They probably want to say like you're value maximizing, but I'm using it as a reference to a popular card game that basically describes you know when you're basically generating value that didn't exist in your existing deck, it's called cheating value. And that's effectively what these armies are trying to do. It's not just because of summoning, it's just because of overall power. You're basically the parts are greater than their sum, or sorry, vice versa. The sum is greater than its pair of parts. And that's the most important, I think, takeaway lessons you can take about going forward. About when you first buy a book and you're trying to understand, is this book going to be good or not, just like put it from the context of that framework. And then if the answer is yes, it's cheating value, then you have to put it, every book is going to cheat value. I think that's just kind of like how it works, right, for Games Workshop. So, and from that perspective, from how much more does it cheat value than all the other books? It's why like sometimes it describes armies as like playing an honest game of Warhammer. Like Slaves of Darkness plays an honest game of Warhammer. It doesn't really cheat values unless you're playing the Splinter Fang spam list with Archeon and the Ravagers, right? Because there's a lot of armies out there that just play an honest game of Warhammer and they don't cheat a lot of value. They have a lot of power, but they don't necessarily cheat a lot of value, and that's why they do consistently not the best at tables, because they don't. I guess Giants to a degree are probably the same kind of thing. They play an honest game of Warhammer with some value, cheating value through board control. Might ear is right ear, but like at the same time, it's a fairly honest game versus like shit, the thing like Seraphon or the Flesh Eater Court army that's gonna respawn like 100 wounds over the period of the game, like things like that. Like they're just there's a paradigm to the power you're giving those units, right? And one of the things they've done through the years is also like when rally used to be completely unconstrained, and like it was just like all of a sudden things were rallying on a 4-up were like the most insane powerful things in the game, because once again, cheating, the most obvious way of cheating value is bringing back models, and it's still to this day the most powerful way of cheating value for a lot of our in the tournaments. So but that is not the only way to cheat value, right? We just use that example as the easiest one to understand from a mental framework. All right, I think I'm almost up to 90 minutes. I really appreciate everybody who's basically stuck around and listened to me rabble on about this. For the most part, I hope that you will effectively like or subscribe if you like this, even though it's just me ranting and no material on the right on the screen. I hope you will also go check out the Patreon for Onwards AOS. Like of course I'm shelling out here, but I gotta do something to explain this time consumption. And then I will see you all across the table hopefully at some point soon. And good luck to everybody. And I look forward to seeing you at a 4th edition. Crack open those indexes and figure out how to cheat your value the best way possible. Cheers, everybody.